She's just the help, a loyal cleaning woman who has been with Julian's family for years, Samantha said, her voice rippling with a casual, practiced laughter that cut through the crisp November air like a serrated blade. Clara stood frozen on the porch of the grand colonial house in Bergen County, the weight of the ceramic tray containing her home-baked cornbread suddenly feeling like a mountain of lead in her aching arms. The words did not just hurt. They acted as a chemical agent, dissolving the very foundation of Clara's existence, leaving her suspended in a vacuum of disbelief, while the cold New Jersey rain began to mist against her weathered face. This was the daughter for whom Clara had scoured the filth of hospital wards for 30 years, the child whose very breath had been paid for by the sacrifice of Clara's own youth. The promise of public retribution simmered in the unseen shadows of the future, a silent vow that every lie told in the warmth of that mansion would eventually be paid for in the currency of absolute humiliation. Betrayal is a chilling silence that echoes louder than any scream. It is the cold realization that the altar of sacrifice has been desecrated by the very person it was built to protect. In this hollow space between a mother's love and a daughter's shame, the seeds of a divine justice are sown, waiting for the frost of truth to shatter the glass walls of deception. Clara's heart did not shatter. It simply went numb, a terrifying, crystalline stasis that allowed her to observe the scene through a veil of agonizing clarity. Through the tall, polished windows of the mansion, she could see the golden glow of the chandelier reflecting off the fine crystal and the polished silver. Samantha looked radiant in a dress that must have cost $3,000, a deep emerald silk that complemented her perfectly styled hair. Beside her, Julian stood with the practiced arrogance of a man who had never known the sting of a day's labor, his hand resting possessively on Samantha's waist as they entertained the elite of New Jersey's real estate world. They were talking to a couple draped in designer labels, people who would never imagine that the woman standing in the rain, wearing a 10-year-old wool coat and orthopedic shoes, was the biological mother of their hostess. The physical pain began in Clara's knuckles, a familiar throbbing ache that served as a rhythmic reminder of her martyrdom. For 3 decades, Clara had been a ghost in the halls of the county hospital. She had worked double shifts in the pediatric oncology ward, cleaning up the most visceral reminders of human fragility. She had inhaled the acrid scent of industrial-grade bleach until it became part of her very pores, a scent that no amount of lavender soap could ever truly erase. Her hands were a map of those 30 years, cracked, swollen at the joints, and permanently stained by the labor of love. Every cent of her meager earnings, every 5-cent tip she found in a waiting room, and every holiday bonus had been funneled into Samantha's life. She had paid for the private tutors, the $500 SAT prep courses, the prestigious university tuition that totaled over $120,000, and finally the secret down payment for this very mansion, disguised as an anonymous gift from a distant relative, so as not to wound Samantha's fragile, upwardly mobile pride. Clara looked down at the cornbread. She had woken up at 4 in the morning to prepare it, using the recipe her own grandmother had brought from the old country, a symbol of heritage and survival. She had spent $12 on the organic honey and the high-quality cornmeal, a significant portion of her weekly grocery budget. Now, the tray felt like an insult, a relic of a mother who was no longer useful in the polished, curated world Samantha had built. The air around her grew colder, the dampness seeping through her coat and into her bones, but it was nothing compared to the frost hardening around her soul. She remembered the nights Samantha had been sick as a child, how Clara would stay awake after a 12-hour shift, singing softly to her, her own body trembling with exhaustion. She remembered the graduation day when she sat in the very back row, wearing a hidden uniform because she had to rush to work immediately after the ceremony, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her daughter walk across the stage. Samantha had not looked for her in the crowd then, and she was not looking for her now. Inside, the laughter erupted again. It was a sound of exclusion, a barrier made of gold and lies. Samantha was gesturing toward the kitchen, perhaps telling a story about the authentic Thanksgiving meal she had supposedly prepared herself, though Clara knew every dish had been catered by an expensive bistro in town for a price of $4,000. The hypocrisy was a suffocating mist. Clara felt the familiar sting of a sob rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down. A sacrificial martyr does not cry in front of the lions. She simply endures. She thought of her small, one-bedroom apartment in a crumbling brick building 20 miles away, where the heat barely worked and the wallpaper was peeling. She had moved there to save money, to ensure that Samantha could live in Bergen County, surrounded by people who spoke of investments and vacations, while Clara spoke to the shadows about her loneliness. As she stood there, a sudden, sharp movement near the bushes caught her eye. A cat, thin and bedraggled, with fur the colour of wet soot, crept out from the shadows of the manicured hedge. It looked at Clara with eyes that held a depth of ancient, weary suffering, a reflection of her own spirit. The animal was shivering, its ribs visible beneath its matted coat, a creature rejected by the warmth of the mansion, just as she was. In that moment, the bond between the woman and the stray was forged in the cold New Jersey rain. They were both remnants of a world that Samantha and her guests chose to ignore. The inconvenient, the unpolished, the real. Clara's mind drifted back to the $150 she had spent on the new shoes Samantha had requested for her birthday 3 months ago, shoes that Clara had never seen her wear. She remembered the $502 she had sent last month, when Samantha claimed a temporary cash flow issue, money that Clara had taken from her own emergency fund for her dental surgery. The realization was a slow, agonizing burn. She was not a mother to Samantha. She was an ATM, a safety net, a secret shame to be utilized and then hidden away like a stain on a white rug. The help. The word echoed in her mind, turning her blood to ice. The front door suddenly opened and the warmth of the house spilled out, carrying the scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume. Julian stepped out, holding a glass of scotch that probably cost more than Clara's weekly electricity bill. He stopped when he saw her, his expression shifting from a smirk to a look of profound annoyance. He didn't offer to help with the heavy tray. He didn't even acknowledge her as his mother-in-law. To him, she was an intruder, a blemish on the perfect Thanksgiving tableau they had created for their influential friends. "Clara, what are you doing standing out here?" Julian asked, his voice low and dripping with condescension. He didn't wait for an answer. He looked at the cornbread with a sneer of disgust. "Samantha told you we were having the event catered. That, whatever that is, doesn't fit the menu. And you're late. The guests are already seated. Samantha is stressed enough as it is without you making things awkward." Clara tried to speak, but her vocal cords felt as though they had been cauterized. She looked past him into the foyer, where Samantha was laughing with a man in a tailored suit. Samantha caught her eye for a fleeting second, and in that moment, Clara saw the naked flash of panic and resentment. Her daughter didn't see a mother who had sacrificed everything. She saw a threat to her social standing. Samantha quickly turned away, intensifying her conversation, effectively erasing Clara from the room. The weight in Clara's chest became unbearable. The agony burn was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical fire consuming her lungs. She felt the 30 years of scrubbing, the 30 years of silence, the 30 years of being less than, so her daughter could be more. It all culminated in this moment of absolute freezing rejection. Julian stepped back into the house, half closing the door. "Just leave the tray on the bench. We'll deal with it later. Maybe it's better if you just head home, Clara." You look tired, and the weather is getting worse. We wouldn't want you getting sick on our account." The door clicked shut, the sound final and hollow. Clara was left alone on the porch, the rain now turning into a steady, cold drizzle. She looked at the ceramic tray, then at the empty bench. She didn't leave the cornbread. Instead, she turned around and walked down the steps, her knees clicking with every movement, her heart a heavy stone in her breast. She walked toward the edge of the driveway, away from the golden lights, away from the daughter she no longer recognized. The stray cat followed her, a silent, dark shadow in the night. The journey toward the truth had begun, and though the path was paved with the shards of her broken heart, Clara knew that the end of her silence would be the beginning of a justice that no amount of Samantha's emerald silk could ever hide. The sacrifice was over. The witness had been born. She walked toward the bus stop, each step a silent declaration of a dignity that could no longer be bought, sold, or hidden in the shadows of a Bergen County mansion. The cold New Jersey rain intensified, transforming the manicured streets of Bergen County into a series of shimmering black rivers that reflected nothing but the indifference of the wealthy. Clara walked down the long, winding driveway of her daughter's estate, her orthopedic shoes squeaking against the wet asphalt with a rhythmic, mournful sound. Every step was a battle against the searing fire in her hip joints, a legacy of 30 years spent scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. She carried the ceramic tray of cornbread pressed against her chest, not because she wanted to save the food, but because the lingering warmth was the only thing keeping her heart from turning into a block of ice. She felt like a phantom, a discarded spirit wandering through a world she had labored to build but was no longer allowed to inhabit. Behind her, the mansion glowed with a mocking golden light, the sounds of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses muffled by the thick, expensive glass of the windows. As she reached the iron gates, a sleek black SUV pulled up, its headlights blinding her for a moment. It was Julian's business partner, a man who had once mistaken Clara for the kitchen staff during a summer barbecue. The vehicle slowed, and for a second, Clara thought they might offer her a ride to the bus stop 3 miles away. Instead, the window rolled down just an inch, and she heard a sharp, derisive snort from inside. "Is that her?" a woman's voice whispered, laden with a cruel amusement. Samantha said the cleaning lady was having some sort of emotional breakdown on the porch. How embarrassing for them. The window rolled up, and the SUV surged forward, splashing a wave of icy, muddy water over Clara's thin wool coat and the hems of her trousers. She stood there, drenched and trembling, as the red taillights disappeared into the mist. She was a ghost in the very life she had financed with her own blood, a blemish on the curated perfection of Samantha's Thanksgiving. Humiliation is not a sudden blow. It is a slow, freezing evaporation of one's humanity. Standing in the shadows of a life she built with her own blood, Clara became a ghost, invisible to the hearts she once warmed. The cruelest betrayal is not the closed door, but the realization that her absence is the only gift they truly desired. The walk to the bus stop felt like a journey through an Arctic wasteland. Her breath came in ragged white plumes, and the agony burn in her chest had migrated to her lungs, making every inhalation feel like she was swallowing broken glass. She thought about the $482 she had spent last month to fix Samantha's designer refrigerator, money she had saved by skipping her own blood pressure medication for 3 weeks. She thought about the $3,050 she had given Julian for his investment venture 2 years ago, a sum she had accrued by working double shifts on Christmas and New Year's Day for 5 consecutive years. None of it mattered now. In their eyes, she was not a provider or a mother. She was a relic of a past they were desperate to bury under layers of silk and lies. Finally, she reached the corner of Franklin Avenue, where a solitary bus stop stood under the flickering, sickly yellow light of a street lamp. The bus wouldn't arrive for another 45 minutes, and the wind began to howl, cutting through her wet clothes like a serrated knife. Her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the handle of her purse. She sat on the cold metal bench, the tray of cornbread now as frigid as the air around her. Across the street, a small, neon-lit convenience store stood as the only beacon of warmth in the desolate night. Clara stood up, her knees cracking with a sound like dry twigs snapping, and hobbled across the road. Inside the store, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor wax, a scent that usually made Clara feel at home, but tonight it felt like a reminder of her servitude. She approached the counter, her hand trembling as she opened her worn leather wallet. Inside were a single $5 bill and 82 cents in loose change. This was all she had left until her Social Security check arrived in 9 days. She had spent the rest of her monthly budget on the ingredients for the cornbread and the bus fare to get to Bergen County. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes and a faded tattoo on his neck, looked at her with a flicker of pity. "Just a slice of the pepperoni pizza," Clara said, her voice a thin, raspy whisper, "and a small cup of warm water, if you can spare it." The clerk nodded, sliding a greasy triangle of pizza into a paper bag. It cost $3.59. As he handed her the change, $2.23, Clara felt a profound sense of defeat. This was her Thanksgiving dinner, a piece of processed dough and cheese consumed in the dark, while her daughter feasted on a catered banquet that cost more than Clara's annual rent. She walked back to the bus stop, the paper bag warming her frozen palms for a few fleeting moments. As she sat back down on the bench, she saw a movement in the shadows near a pile of discarded cardboard boxes. A cat crept out, its fur matted and soaked, the color of wet soot. It was the same stray she had seen earlier near the mansion, a creature that seemed to have followed her into the darkness. It was incredibly thin, its ribcage protruding like the hull of a wrecked ship, and its eyes, a startling, intelligent gold, were fixed on the paper bag in her hand. The cat didn't meow. It simply sat there, shivering with a violent, rhythmic intensity that mirrored Clara's own tremors. "You're alone too, aren't you?" Clara whispered, the words hanging in the frozen air. She looked at the slice of pizza, her own stomach growling with a hollow, aching hunger. She hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, having saved her appetite for the family dinner that never happened. But as she looked at the cat, she saw something more than just a hungry animal. She saw a reflection of her own soul, discarded, unwanted, and left to perish in the cold while the world celebrated behind closed doors. With fingers that were stiff and painful, Clara tore the slice of pizza in half. She placed the larger portion on top of the paper bag and slid it across the wet pavement toward the cat. The animal hesitated for a heartbeat, its golden eyes searching hers, before it moved forward with a desperate grace. It began to eat, the raw hunger in its movements so visceral that it brought tears to Clara's eyes. She ate her own half, the cold grease coating her tongue, but she felt a strange, flickering warmth in her chest. For the first time that night, she wasn't just a victim of betrayal. She was a provider again. She was the sacrificial martyr. But this time, her sacrifice was for a creature that truly needed it, one that wouldn't throw her kindness into a trash can. "We are the forgotten ones, Barnaby," she said, giving the cat a name on a whim. The cat looked up, a small piece of cheese clinging to its whisker, and let out a soft, guttural purr that vibrated through the metal of the bench. It was the first sound of affection Clara had heard in months. She turned her head, looking back toward the distant hills where the mansions of Bergen County sat like ivory towers. From this distance, she could see the glow of Samantha's house, a tiny, brilliant speck against the black velvet of the night. She imagined the scene inside, the toasts being made to success and family, the laughter that erased her existence, the calculated lies that Samantha told her guests to maintain her fragile, emerald-clad facade. Clara felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The long suffering was reaching its peak. The UATUC, the deep, festering grievance, was no longer a weight she carried. It was a fuel. Every insult Julian had hurled, every silence Samantha had maintained, every dollar Clara had bled out of her own life to support their vanity, it was all being recorded in the ledger of her mind. She thought about the $322 she had paid for Samantha's emergency car repair 3 weeks ago, which she now realized was likely just more money for a designer handbag. She thought about the 112 miles she had traveled over the last month to run errands for a daughter who couldn't be bothered to call her on her birthday. The bus finally appeared in the distance, two glowing eyes cutting through the mist. It was a heavy, lumbering beast, an 8,200-pound machine that would carry her back to her lonely, cold apartment. As the bus pulled up to the curb with a hiss of air brakes, Clara looked down at Barnaby. The cat had finished the pizza and was now sitting regally at her feet, its golden eyes fixed on her with an unblinking intensity. It didn't move toward the bus, but it didn't retreat into the shadows either. "I have to go, little one," Clara said, her heart breaking all over again. She reached out, her calloused, scarred hand stroking the cat's wet head. To her surprise, the cat didn't flinch. Instead, it leaned into her touch, its purr growing louder, a tiny engine of survival in the dark. As Clara stepped onto the bus, she handed the driver her last $2.23, the coins clinking into the machine with a sound like a funeral bell. She took a seat at the very back, pressing her forehead against the cold window pane. As the bus began to move, she looked out and saw Barnaby still sitting under the flickering street lamp, a small, dark silhouette against the vast, indifferent night. The bus began its long, rattling journey away from the land of lies and emerald silk. Clara closed her eyes, and in the silence of the nearly empty vehicle, she didn't pray for forgiveness. She didn't pray for her daughter's love. She prayed for the strength to survive the night, and for the wisdom to know what to do when the truth finally demanded to be heard. The divine justice was still a distant thunder, but the storm was gathering, and Clara knew that when it finally broke, no mansion in Bergen County would be strong enough to withstand the flood of a mother's righteous fury. She was a ghost no longer. She was a witness, and her testimony would be written in the ruins of their pride. The bus journey back to the crumbling brick apartment building felt like a descent into a forgotten circle of a frozen purgatory. Clara sat huddled in the back, the dampness of her clothes now a permanent, icy skin. In her lap, hidden beneath the folds of her wet wool coat, Barnaby was a small, vibrating weight of heat. She had not been able to leave him on that desolate street corner. The sight of those golden eyes had been the final anchor that prevented her soul from drifting into the abyss of total despair. As the vehicle rattled over the potholes of the industrial district, the city lights outside blurred into streaks of sickly yellow and neon blue. Clara felt every one of her 67 years in the marrow of her bones, the agony burn, now a dull, rhythmic throb that seemed to keep time with the bus's engine. She was returning to a home that was little more than a box for her memories, a stark contrast to the Emerald Silk Palace, where her daughter was currently celebrating a life built on a foundation of Clara's silent suffering. True betrayal is never a single blow. It is the violent unraveling of a lifetime's worth of devotion. When the very foundation of one's existence is rooted in selfless love, the discovery of such calculated cruelty acts as a spiritual extinction. It is the precise moment when the victim's internal compass shatters, leaving no North Star to guide the soul back to its former innocence. This collapse marks the end of a long-held delusion, a brutal awakening where the warmth of sacrifice is instantly replaced by the frigid clarity of truth. In this hollow silence, the martyr dies, and a witness to reality is born. Once inside her apartment, the air was barely warmer than the street. The radiator hissed and clanked, a mechanical ghost struggling to provide a pittance of heat. Clara set Barnaby down and began to dry him with a thin, frayed towel. As she rubbed the damp fur, her fingers brushed against something hard and cold beneath the soot-colored hair. She leaned in, her vision blurred by the dim light of a single 40-watt bulb. It was a small, circular tag made of heavy brass, attached to a collar so fine it had been invisible in the dark. Engraved on the metal were the words, Barnaby, property of Vance, reward if found, followed by a phone number and an address in an area of New Jersey that even Samantha's neighbors could only dream of inhabiting. This was not a common stray. This was a lost companion of the elite, a creature that belonged to a world of power and ancient wealth. Clara's hand trembled as she looked at the brass tag. She felt a surge of ironic bitterness. Even this cat, discarded in the rain, possessed a value that far exceeded her own in the eyes of the world. She reached for her old, cracked cell phone, intending to call the number, but a sudden chime interrupted her. It was a notification from a social media app, a pocket dial, live stream notification from Samantha's account. Samantha must have accidentally triggered the broadcast while her phone was tucked into her silk clutch. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she tapped the screen. The audio was muffled at first, the sounds of the party distant, but then the voices became sharp and clear as Samantha and Julian stepped into a quiet hallway, away from their guests. "Did you call the facility in Pennsylvania?" Julian's voice was cold, stripped of the charm he used for the real estate moguls. "I did," Samantha replied, her tone sharp and devoid of any lingering daughterly affection. "The monthly cost is only $2,400. It's a bargain compared to anything in Bergen County. It's far enough away that we won't have to visit more than once a year, and the staff there specialized in difficult elderly residents. They'll keep her contained." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her breath hitching in a throat that felt constricted by invisible wire. The apartment around her seemed to tilt, the peeling wallpaper closing in like the walls of a tomb. "And the house in Elmwood?" Julian asked. "We need that equity cleared before the end of the fiscal year. The development deal for the New Jersey waterfront requires at least $453,000 in liquid capital. If we don't get that house on the market by January, we're finished." "Don't worry," Samantha whispered, and Clara could almost see the predatory glint in her daughter's emerald eyes. "The title is in her name, but I've already talked to the lawyer about a power of attorney based on cognitive decline. After tonight's performance, standing in the rain with that ridiculous tray of cornbread like a senile servant, it won't be hard to prove she's unfit. She thinks she's being a martyr, but she's actually just making it easier for us to declare her a ward of the state. We'll have her moved by the second week of December. I'm tired of her being a blemish on our lives. She's served her purpose. Now she's just an obstacle we need to remove." The phone slipped from Clara's hand, clattering onto the linoleum floor. The silence that followed was louder than the screams of 1,000 storms. 30 years. 30 years of scrubbing hospital floors until her skin was raw. 30 years of wearing second-hand clothes so Samantha could wear designer labels. 30 years of skipping meals so Samantha could have a university education that cost $128,000. It had all been for nothing. To her daughter, she was not a mother, not a human being with a soul and a history of sacrifice. She was a blemish. She was a financial asset to be liquidated, a nuisance to be hidden away in a cheap, distant warehouse for the elderly. The agony burn erupted into a volcanic roar within her chest. Clara stood up, her knees buckling, and she had to lean against the cold metal sink for support. She looked at her hands, the swollen joints, the permanent stains of bleach and labor. These hands had built Samantha's life. These hands had held Samantha when she cried, had worked 3 jobs simultaneously to ensure Samantha never knew the hunger Clara felt tonight. And in return, those same hands were being prepared for the shackles of an unwanted institution. The betrayal was so absolute, so calculated, that it transcended mere sadness. It was a desecration of the sacred bond of life. She looked at Barnaby, who was now sitting on her small, worn-out sofa, his golden eyes watching her with a terrifyingly human intelligence. The cat didn't move, didn't meow. It simply bore witness to the total collapse of a woman's world. Clara felt a strange, cold sensation washing over her. The long suffering was over. The Kamchu, the quiet endurance that had defined her for decades, shattered into a million jagged pieces of crystalline resolve. She realized that she had been an accomplice in her own destruction by remaining silent, by allowing her love to be exploited until there was nothing left but the husks of her dreams. The house in Elmwood was her only sanctuary, a small 2-bedroom cottage she had inherited from her own parents and meticulously maintained with her meager savings. It was the only thing she truly owned, the only physical proof of her existence. And now, the person she had loved most in the world was planning to steal it while calling it an act of necessity. Samantha's words echoed in the cramped apartment. She's served her purpose. Clara picked up her phone from the floor. The screen was cracked, a jagged line running through the image of Samantha's smiling face on the wallpaper. With a steady hand, she dialed the number on the brass tag. She didn't think about the reward or the wealth of the cat's owner. She thought about the truth. She thought about the 30 years of silence that were about to end. As the phone rang, she felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The sacrificial martyr had died in the cold rain of Bergen County, and in her place, a woman with a signed death warrant for her daughter's pride had emerged. The phone was answered on the 3rd ring by a voice that sounded as weary and hollow as her own. "Hello?" the man said, his tone one of profound, muted grief. "I have Barnaby," Clara said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a cold, steady chime that cut through the silence of the room. "He is safe. He is with me." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Thank God," the man whispered. You don't know what that cat means. He is all I have left of my wife. Please, where are you? I will send someone immediately." "I am at 412 Oak Street, apartment 3B, Clara replied. "But I don't want a reward, Mr. Vance. I want a witness." She hung up the phone and sat down next to Barnaby. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking away the final moments of her daughter's deception. The truth was no longer a burden. It was a weapon, and Clara was finally ready to wield it. The spiritual extinction was complete, and in the hollow silence of her apartment, the air began to hum with the electricity of a coming storm. The justice she had never sought was now the only thing left to live for, and she would ensure that the price of Samantha's emerald silk was paid in the absolute, public ruin of her dignity. The divine justice was no longer a distant hope. It was sitting on her sofa, purring in the dark. The black sedan that arrived at the curb of the crumbling apartment building was not merely a vehicle. It was a silent, predatory manifestation of power, its engine humming with the quiet confidence of old money. When Theodore Vance stepped out, he did not look like the titans of industry described in the financial journals. He was a man hollowed out by grief, his eyes mirroring the same ancient, weary gold as Barnaby's. He looked at the peeling brick of Clara's building, then at the cracked windows, and finally at the woman standing in the doorway with his wife's cat in her arms. In that silent exchange, a bridge was built over the vast canyon of social class. Theodore Vance didn't see a cleaning woman in a damp wool coat. He saw the only person in the world who had treated his most precious connection with dignity when no one was watching. Inside the cramped apartment, Theodore sat on the worn-out sofa, his presence making the room feel even smaller, yet strangely more substantial. He listened as Clara spoke, not just about finding Barnaby, but about the decades of scrubbing, the secret payments, and the chilling conversation she had overheard on the live stream. He looked at the legal documents Clara had gathered, the records of the $312,000 she had funneled into Samantha's life over 30 years, the title to the Elmwood house, and the receipts for the temporary loans that Julian had never intended to repay. Theodore's face remained a mask of stoic calm, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the brass handle of his cane. "You have been a saint in a den of thieves, Clara," Theodore said, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "They believe you are a blemish to be erased. They believe your silence is a sign of weakness. They are about to learn that silence is the sound of a storm gathering just before the flood." Clara looked at him, her eyes no longer shimmering with the tears of a victim. The agony burn had solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. She didn't ask for the reward of $500,000 that was promised on the tag. Instead, she asked for something far more valuable. She asked for the resources to conduct a final judicial dinner, a performance of servitude that would serve as the closing argument for her daughter's trial. Theodore agreed, his own need for justice for the discarded and the lonely aligning perfectly with hers. Over the next 72 hours, while Samantha and Julian were busy finalizing the paperwork for the care facility in Pennsylvania, Clara was secretly signing her own documents. With the help of Theodore's elite legal team, she revoked the power of attorney she had once blindly granted, placed the Elmwood house into an ironclad private trust, and officially terminated the secret $6,000 monthly subsidy she had been providing for the mansion's upkeep, a payment Samantha and Julian didn't even realize came from her meager retirement fund and life insurance dividends. Dignity is a silent flame that burns brightest in the heart of the humiliated. When a mother finally stops bleeding for a child who only craves more, the world shifts on its axis. The transition from victim to judge is not loud. It is a quiet, terrifying stillness, where love is replaced by a divine mandate for truth. The final dinner took place 3 days later. Clara returned to the Bergen County mansion, not as a guest, but under the guise of an apology. She told Samantha she wanted to cook one last traditional meal to make up for the awkwardness of Thanksgiving. Samantha, believing her plan to institutionalize her mother was moving forward perfectly, agreed with a patronizing smirk. She even invited Julian's most influential business associates, thinking this would be the perfect time to show how charitable they were being toward her failing mother before sending her away. The house was filled with the scent of roasted rosemary and expensive wine, but to Clara, the atmosphere felt like a courtroom before the sentencing. Clara moved through the kitchen with a haunting, ghost-like efficiency. She wore a simple, dark dress, her back straighter than it had been in years, despite the ache in her spine. She served the guests with the same calloused hands that had once scrubbed their toilets, but her eyes held a chilling, glacial coldness. Samantha and Julian sat at the head of the table, basking in the praise of their peers, laughing about their upcoming real estate expansion and their newfound freedom. They spoke of Clara as if she weren't in the room, making subtle jokes about her forgetfulness and her quaint habits. "Mother, the wine is getting a bit low," Samantha said, her voice dripping with a fake, honeyed sweetness for the benefit of the guests. "And do try not to spill on the tablecloth. It's hand-woven lace from France. It cost more than your apartment's annual rent. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned over and refilled Samantha's glass with a vintage red that Theodore Vance had secretly provided. A wine so rare it cost $9,000 a bottle. Samantha, ignorant of its value, gulped it down like water. As Clara moved around the table, she felt the silent storm reaching its peak. Every smile Samantha directed at the guests was a lie. Every touch Julian shared with a business partner was a calculation. They were vultures, feasting on a carcass they hadn't realized was still alive. Julian was just telling us about the Elmwood development, one of the guests, a wealthy developer named Marcus, said. That property is a gold mine. You must be thrilled to have the title cleared. Oh, it was a process, Julian lied, swirling his scotch. The previous owner was, let's just say, resistant to progress. But we've managed to settle everything. We'll be breaking ground in January. It's about creating a legacy, you see. Clara stood by the sideboard, her hands folded neatly in front of her. In her pocket was a single small remote control that Theodore Vance's team had installed to link the house's grand media system to a secure server. On that server were the recordings of the live-streamed betrayal, the bank statements showing Samantha's theft, and the legal notices of the trust that now protected Clara's assets. She watched as Samantha laughed, the emerald silk of her dress shimmering under the chandelier. Her daughter looked like a queen, but to Clara, she looked like a thief wearing stolen jewelry. The agony burn was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow clarity. Clara realized that she no longer hated Samantha. She simply observed her as one would observe a dangerous, invasive species. The love that had once blinded her had been cauterized by the frost of the Bergen County rain. She thought about the 365 nights a year, for 30 years, that she had worked so Samantha could sleep in peace. She thought about the $120,000 in tuition that had bought Samantha the education she was now using to plot her mother's demise. The ledger was full, and the debt was about to be called in. Clara, dear, why don't you head to the kitchen and start on the dessert? Samantha said, dismissing her with a flick of her manicured hand. We have big news to share with our friends, and we'd like some privacy. The news of my departure? Clara asked, her voice cutting through the dinner chatter like a guillotine blade. The table went silent. Samantha's smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward her guests. Mother, don't be dramatic. We talked about your health. You're tired. Go rest. I am not tired, Samantha, Clara said, stepping into the golden light of the chandelier. Her voice was no longer the raspy whisper of a cleaning woman. It was the resonance of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. I am awake. For 30 years, I was the silence that supported your noise. I was the poverty that funded your wealth. I was the blemish that allowed you to feel spotless. But the silence is over. Julian stood up, his face reddening with anger. Clara, that's enough. You're making a scene. Guests, please excuse her. She's had a very long day, and her cognitive state has been fluctuating. My cognitive state is perfect, Julian, Clara replied, her gaze fixing on him with an intensity that made him stagger back an inch. I remember every dollar. I remember every lie. And I remember the address of the facility in Pennsylvania you chose for me because it was a bargain. Did you tell your guests that your business expansion is funded by the theft of a widow's cottage? Did you tell them that the help they see before them is the person who actually pays the taxes on this very mansion? The guests began to murmur, their faces shifting from amusement to profound discomfort. Samantha's hand trembled so violently that wine spilled onto her emerald silk, a dark, blood-red stain spreading across her chest. The silent storm had broken. Clara felt a surge of cold, righteous power. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was the architect of their ruin. She turned toward the media console, her thumb hovering over the remote. The goddess of revenge had arrived to collect her dues, and the meal they had just consumed would be the last one they ever ate in a house that didn't belong to them. The air in the room grew heavy with the scent of impending judgment, and as Clara looked at her daughter's terrified face, she knew that the emerald facade was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces of truth. The dinner was over, and the sentencing was about to begin. Clara stood at the threshold of the grand dining room, her thumb pressing firmly against the small black remote in her pocket. The golden light of the chandelier suddenly felt harsh, illuminating the rot that had festered behind the emerald silk and the polished silver for far too long. The silence in the room was not one of peace, but of a held breath, a collective pause before the final collapse of a fraudulent empire. Samantha was laughing, a sound of pure, unearned triumph, her hand resting on a glass of wine that cost more than Clara's monthly medication. Julian was leaning toward Marcus, the developer, his voice low as he discussed the liquidation of the Elmwood cottage, the final theft of a mother's sanctuary. They were ready to cast her into the shadows of an institution, believing her voice had been successfully stifled by 3 decades of servitude. They were wrong. True judgment is not a scream. It is a cold, unwavering light that reveals the rot beneath the silk. When the sacrificial lamb becomes the architect of truth, the silence of the room becomes a suffocating weight for the guilty. It is the moment where vanity meets its final, unyielding mirror. With a single, decisive click, the grand 85-inch television screen above the fireplace flickered to life. It didn't show the real estate promotional video Samantha had prepared. Instead, the room was filled with the grainy, unmistakable footage of the live stream Samantha had accidentally left running. The guests gasped as Samantha's voice, sharp and predatory, echoed through the high-ceilinged room. "He specializes in difficult elderly residents. They'll keep her contained." The image shifted to a series of scanned bank statements, highlighted in brilliant red. The figures were staggering. $6,000 a month funneled from a secret account to pay the mansion's property taxes, an account funded entirely by Clara's life insurance dividends and the remnants of her retirement. Then came the final blow, the legal trust document, dated 48 hours ago, showing that the title to the Elmwood house had been moved into a private foundation managed by Theodore Vance, rendering Julian's equity non-existent. Samantha's face drained of colour, the emerald of her dress now clashing violently with her sickly pale skin. She tried to stand, but her knees seemed to have turned to water. "Mother, what is this? This is a misunderstanding. You're confused. I told you she was failing." "The only thing failing in this room, Samantha, is your deception," Clara said, her voice a cold, resonant bell that silenced every other sound. "I am not confused. I have been a witness for 30 years. I watched you take my youth, my health, and my dignity, and I gave it all willingly, because I believed a mother's love could fill the void in your soul. But love cannot grow in a heart that views family as a blemish to be erased." The front door opened, and Theodore Vance walked in, followed by 2 men in dark, tailored suits, his lead counsel and a representative from the New Jersey Real Estate Commission. Theodore didn't look at the guests. He looked only at Clara, a nod of profound respect passing between them. Barnaby followed at his heels, the cat's golden eyes surveying the room with a chilling indifference. "Julian," Theodore said, his voice like the crack of a whip, "I've reviewed your investment proposals. Not only are they based on assets you do not own, but they are built on a foundation of elder abuse and financial fraud. My firm is withdrawing all support, and every associate in this room is being handed a file detailing your attempts to illegally seize the Elmwood property. The New Jersey waterfront deal is dead. And as for this mansion, Since the monthly tax subsidy from Clara's trust has been terminated as of 6 o'clock tonight, I believe you have approximately 30 days before the foreclosure proceedings begin on your $453,000 arrears. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian's business associates began to stand, their faces masks of disgust. Marcus, the developer, looked at Julian with a cold sneer. "You tried to bring me into a deal based on a lie, Julian. Don't ever call my office again. And Samantha, I think our firm will be looking for a new listing agent. We prefer our representatives to have a soul." One by one, the elite of Bergen County walked out, leaving the half-eaten catered dinner and the expensive wine behind. They left Samantha and Julian standing in the ruins of their pride, the emerald silk of Samantha's dress now stained with the dark, ugly red of the wine she had spilled. Samantha collapsed into her chair, her breath coming in ragged, ugly sobs. "You ruined us. Everything we worked for. How could you do this to your own daughter?" Clara walked toward her, not with anger, but with a terrifying, peaceful clarity. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw the small, selfish child she had raised, the one who had never learned that sacrifice has a limit. "I didn't ruin you, Samantha. I simply stopped holding up the sky for you. You were the one who chose to build your palace on a mother's broken back. I spent $128,000 to give you an education, and the only thing you learned was how to be a predator. I gave you my silence for 30 years, and you used it to plan my imprisonment. Today, the bill is due, and I am no longer paying it." Julian tried to step forward, his face twisted in a desperate, ugly rage. "You can't do this. We'll sue. You're senile." Everyone heard Samantha say it. The legal representative from Theodore's team stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder. "Actually, Mr. Mr. Vance's team has recorded every interaction over the last 72 hours, including your discussion about the care facility in Pennsylvania. In the state of New Jersey, conspiracy to commit fraud and elder exploitation carries a significant prison sentence. We have already filed the preliminary report with the district attorney. I suggest you spend your remaining 30 days in this house finding a very good lawyer. You're going to need one." Clara turned away from them, her heart feeling lighter than it had since the day Samantha was born. The agony burn was gone, replaced by the cool, refreshing air of freedom. She looked at the room, the hand-woven lace, the crystal, the emerald silk, and realized it was all just tinsel. None of it could buy back the 30 years she had lost, but it could no longer steal a single minute of her future. "I am leaving now," Clara said, her voice steady and calm. "I am going to my house in Elmwood, the house that my parents built with their own hands and that I saved with mine. You are no longer welcome there. You are no longer welcome in my life. You spoke of me as a blemish, Samantha. But as of tonight, I am the only thing in your life that was real. And now you have nothing." Clara walked toward the door, her orthopedic shoes clicking on the marble floor with a sound of absolute authority. Theodore Vance met her at the foyer, offering his arm. Barnaby walked beside her, his purr a low, rhythmic vibration of victory. As she stepped out into the crisp New Jersey night, the rain had stopped. The air was cold, but it felt like a blessing, a cleansing frost that had finally killed the parasites. She didn't look back at the golden lights of the mansion. She looked toward the horizon, where the modest lights of Elmwood waited for her. In the months that followed, the fall of Samantha and Julian was as public as it was devastating. Julian declared bankruptcy after the waterfront deal collapsed, and Samantha's real estate license was permanently revoked following an investigation into her financial dealings. They were forced to sell the emerald silk, the designer furniture, and finally, the mansion itself. In a final poetic act of justice, Samantha was seen months later working as a night shift cleaner at a local shopping mall, her hands finally learning the sting of the bleach that had defined her mother's life. Julian disappeared into a world of low-level debt and broken promises, a man whose only legacy was the vacuum he had created. Clara, meanwhile, turned the Elmwood cottage into a sanctuary for retired nurses and hospital staff, a place where the help was finally treated like royalty. She lived her remaining years not as a martyr, but as a queen of her own small, honest kingdom. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. If you were in her place, what would you do when the people you loved treated you like a burden and called it family? Share your thoughts in the comments, because someone reading them may need that courage today. This story is fiction, created for reflection and conversation. If you want more stories like this, please like, subscribe, and stay close. This story serves as a profound testament to the necessity of maintaining one's personal boundaries and financial independence, especially when the sanctity of family is used as a shroud for exploitation. Clara's journey reminds us that dignity is not a gift granted by others, but a fortress built through self-respect and the refusal to be erased. When love becomes a one-way street of sacrifice, it ceases to be a bond and becomes a chain. In the modern world, where status often masks character, the truth remains that our value is not defined by our utility to others' ambitions, but by the integrity of our own souls. Financial independence at any age is not merely about currency. It is about the power to say no to cruelty and the freedom to walk away from those who mistake kindness for weakness. True justice often requires the patience to wait for the truth to manifest, proving that while betrayal may burn, the fires of righteousness will eventually consume the architect of the lie, leaving only the pure gold of a spirit reclaimed. Always.